Well, hi, and welcome to Mending Naturally Network. And here we are. We're ready to go, and we're going to answer your questions live. This program is for information, and it really refers to what I do with my patients in my clinic, and it should never be substituted for what you and your physician work out. But it does help us figure out what we can do with our kids right now. Just came back from the Generation Rescue Autism Education Summit, and it was a great summit. And we had a time to talk with lots of new families who have newly diagnosed children on the autism spectrum. It's a big problem, and we're having a lot of kids being diagnosed every week, and the parents don't know where to turn or what to do first. In my clinic, what I tend to do first is to assure them that there's a lot of things biomedically we can do to improve the temper tantrums, to improve the not sleeping, to the abnormal stools. I think that's a good place to start. But actually, what is autism? And they get the diagnosis from the neurologist, the behavioral pediatrician, maybe even a psychiatrist. And they're told that it's a mental illness and there's not anything that they can really do about it. But there is a lot of things that we can do because they have medical problems. Autism is still diagnosed under the whole category of mental psychoses, and yet they're having problems with digestion. They have chronic constipation, chronic diarrhea, problems with sleeping, allergies, recurrent infections like ear infections. So there are medical problems that if we address, then some of the behaviors that they're exhibiting improve. So what is the first thing that I recommend with these patients? Well, the first thing I do, especially for your newbies out there, is to remove all dairy products, cheese, milk, anything that comes from a cow's udder. And you have to read the boxes that they have all kinds of milk in there, but they have to be dairy free. And you're going to be hearing a lot about that as we discuss this program week after week. And as the questions come in, and you're going to hear, oh no, he's going to talk about dairy again. But dairy, it seems to be not tolerated well with these children. They tend to crave it. My son certainly did. He craved a gallon of milk every day, and these kids crave cheese. What happens is that dairy seems to be converted to a morphine-like substance. The protein in dairy, the casein, can be converted to caseomorphine. And caseomorphine is like an opiate substance, so it's very addictive, and it makes them irritable, cranky, and crave that to just about anything. They want dairy. Gluten you'll hear about shortly, and gluten is converted to a gluteomorphine or gliadorphin, and it too is very addicting and is constipating, and they will crave those two foods. So you'll hear a lot about a gluten-free, dairy-free diet. Where did it get its underpinnings? Well, right here. They cannot deal with dairy. And the first thing that I always tell the families to do is to remove dairy. Why? Because it's an easy thing for moms and dads to wrap their heads around. It can't come from a cow. It's got to be a dairy-free product. And usually now products will say dairy-free on the label. And when you get to the gluten part, it'll say gluten-free and dairy-free. So I remove the dairy from the children's diet. And you can start that right away. Once you've mastered that, then I tend to remove gluten from the diet as well. And gluten is a part of all of the flours that we commonly eat, and it helps hold things together. It comes from the Latin word glue or gluten, kind of holds things together. So pizza dough, for example, is gluten-enriched flour. It gives it its elastic, rubbery texture, like that's how they toss it up in the air. Or a bagel, gluten-enriched. It's got that chewy, pull-apart kind of goodness. Well, that's not so good for our kids, okay? So we're going to remove all flours that contain gluten. And that can be quite a challenge because these kids are very, very addicted to it. And that's their pancakes, that's their waffles, that's their breads, that's their rolls, that's their pizza, especially for the older kids. And it has to be 100%. It should never be considered as a treat. It needs to be considered as a toxin for their brain. And I can't tell you how many times the parents have come to me and said, when I removed all the dairy and all the gluten, and it is a big pain, my child started sleeping through the night. My child developed eye contact again. We started saying words again. So I do have kids, including my own son, who are very limited in what they eat. My son only ate Chips Ahoy cookies. Okay, that's going to have gluten in there. French fries, Fruit Loops. I don't know where he got Fruit Loops from, right? And bacon. You need a pound of bacon a day if you'd let him. And a gallon of milk. That was his diet. And because I'm a pediatrician, he got a Flintstones vitamin. That was it. And when I came home and told my wife that we need to go gluten and dairy free, she said, well, I know what dairy is, but what's gluten? And so you have to do some research on the internet. My website has a lot of things that will tell you what's gluten containing that you need to avoid and what's dairy containing, because there's a lot of code words and you think you're dairy free when there were other words that you didn't quite recognize on the labels and they actually were dairy. So we've got to remove the gluten, got to remove the dairy. Now, most of you guys know that already, and that's kind of cool. But for my newbies out there, if you're just putting your toes in the pond here, this is going to really help. Now, what is it going to help? It can help with focus. It can help with concentration. It can help with words. It can help with sleep and bowel function. So just those little removals of things can make a big difference. I'd probably say in my practice, it affects 80% of my new patients very positively, where they say, I just got diagnosed at UCLA with autism, and they said not to try that gluten-free, dairy-free diet because it's just a bunch of hooey. And I listened to them for a while, but then I was speaking to somebody and I said, oh, what the heck, I might as well give it a try. And it was amazing. And it set them on the course of biomedical medicine. In other words, functional medicine, finding things that can help your child on the autism spectrum feel a whole lot better. And if something's causing tummy aches, constipation, problem sleeping, removing it will help. When I think about autism, well, as a pediatrician, you get the formal diagnosis, obviously, if you have a child who's got severe communication disorder, both speaking as well as understanding language, they call it communication delay, that they have some abnormal movements. They called it stereotypia, or stimming is the common word, where they're shaking their hands or doing kind of funky things. We call that stimming. They can be scoping with their eyes, looking at things, out of the corner of their eyes. Getting stuck on things, obsessive compulsive behaviors, ritualistic behaviors, doors opening, doors closing, lights on, lights off. So that's what we call being obsessed or getting stuck on things, perseverating on things. Abnormal toy play, abnormal affection. These are things that give you that kind of formal diagnosis of autism. But how do I look at autism? I see autism as a spectrum disorder. Many of you have heard that term, autism spectrum disease. That means at one end of the spectrum, you've got one group of kids, and at the other end of the spectrum, you have another group of kids. This group here, they come into my office, they're sitting in the corner, they're rocking, they're maybe biting their wrist, finger in the ear, maybe going ee, sitting in a diaper, and they're 8, okay? What does that tell me? That tells me right away that incoming stimuli are not being processed properly by the brain. They're not understanding language, mom saying, I love you. They're not understanding dad saying, go get your shoes. They're not understanding what poop feels in their diaper. In other words, the stimuli coming to their brain makes no sense in our world. That's this guy on the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum is a little kid in school. He's got friends, he's playing soccer. But when the teacher's talking, say, about George Washington being the first president of the United States, that auditory stimuli coming in, fought in the Revolutionary War, married a wonderful lady named Martha, that auditory stimuli coming in, he's not getting that so well. We call that attention deficit disorder. He's not responding to verbal stimuli very well. He's not responding to all stimuli, And our kids are on this spectrum. In other words, the more stimuli that they process and respond to in a normal fashion, potty trained, eating foods, whatever, the higher functioning they are. And the fewer stimuli they respond to, the lower functioning they are. So that's what our issue is, and where our kids are on this spectrum. The more things that they relate to in a normal way, the higher functioning they are. Not all the way over. So somewhere along the way is a functional side, meaning that everybody on this side is functional. They got some quirks about them, okay, but they're functioning okay in a classroom. Everybody on the other side of that wall, a little too dysfunctional, will be called neurotypical. And I see it as my job is trying to fix it so they respond to stimuli in a more normal fashion so I can get them over into that functional quirky side. Hey, quirky gets a college degree, quirky gets married, and my wife would probably say she married a quirky husband. So it is possible to move these kids to get them to respond to stimuli in a normal fashion. But how I look at it also is that these these brains are like computers, a hard drive system. And all of your therapists, your speech therapists, your physical therapists, they're all like software engineers. They're trying to load software in. And if the hard drive isn't working well, good night. It's just not going to happen. And that's why maybe some of you out there have been very frustrated. We've been doing speech therapy for a year or ABA therapy for a year. We thought the therapies were the way to go, and not much is happening. Well, because the hard drive isn't working and they keep trying to load things in there. And after 6 months of tremendous amount of energy from wonderful people, very little progress is being made. So I look at what we do as kind of like the hard drive repair. Let's fix the hard drive if we can, and we'll get language. Let's fix the hard drive and we'll get motor coordination, motor planning. We'll take apraxia and we'll turn it into praxia. A means not speaking. So get them from not speaking to speaking. Get them from not sleeping to sleeping, from not potty trained to potty trained. Okay. In other words, help them respond to stimuli more and more normally. And that's kind of the fun thing that we get to do. We get to see some great progress. There's some hooey out there about, well, if you don't do it by 5, it'll never happen or whatever. I don't believe in these artificial limits that somebody comes out with and types about it on the internet, because I've seen some really wonderful things happen with our teenagers and our young 20-year-olds. So it's never too late to get started. Obviously, if we could all start it all over again, starting at age 2 or age 3 would be better. The next thing I need to consider once we've done the gluten-free, dairy-free diet, we've got the diagnosis of autism. People will say to me, so my child's still not sleeping. You said that once we went gluten-free, dairy-free, he'd sleep through the night. Not my kid, okay? Well, that happens. So what do? Well, the first thing that I tend to do with children in my clinic is I start them on melatonin. I like melatonin. It's what our body makes. There have been studies done in the 1990s that have demonstrated that children and adults on the autism spectrum don't make enough melatonin. Well, if you don't make enough insulin, you give insulin. And if you don't make enough thyroid, you give thyroid. So if you don't make enough melatonin, why wouldn't we give melatonin? You're always going to hear on the internet, I've got to be careful because people are searching everywhere. Oh, you shouldn't do this and you shouldn't do that. And one of the things that comes up every now and then is you shouldn't give melatonin. Well, it's what our body makes. It's very, very safe. And if you're not making enough and I give melatonin, it's a good thing. And most parents, I'd say 9 out of 10, that say of a child who sleeps through the night, that's a good thing. And if all I have to do is use a milligram of melatonin, a half a milligram of melatonin, well, why not? So I use melatonin as my first line for sleep. And I'd probably say half the time, melatonin by itself, it's amazing. And, during sleep, that's when the body does a lot of things. It's called a circadian rhythm. The body and the brain go through a lot of cleaning mechanisms while we're asleep. And the brain organizes memories from the day and stuff like that. So I think it's really important that we allow the body to sleep. In other words, the gains of sleep can outweigh any particular negatives that maybe some melatonin will do. So I do like to use melatonin. Well, what's next? Well, if the brain is still agitated and melatonin isn't doing everything that it should, I'll put them on some theanine. Theanine is amino acid. I like the L form, so you'll hear L-theanine. And I'll put them on theanine and theanine and melatonin. So now I'm stacking the two together to see if I can get the child to sleep. Generally, kids who are 5 and older, I'll start them at 100 milligrams of theanine, 1 milligram or 2 milligrams of melatonin. I'll see if I can get them to calm down with the theanine and the melatonin, but that may not be enough. So I'll start wondering, well, if they have a lot of obsessive compulsive behaviors, I'll put them on 5-hydroxytryptophan, 5-HTP, L-theanine, and melatonin. In other words, I'm trying to build the right chemicals in the brain, neurotransmitters in the brain, that will promote a very safe, deep, restful sleep. The child needs to sleep. The parent needs to sleep too, okay? But we'll do it for the child. But I know if I make the child sleep for 8 or 9 hours and mom gets to sleep for 8 or 9 hours, she'll be more robust for taking care of a special needs kid during the day than if she'd been up, 22 hours a night. I've had some kids where they may sleep 1 or 2 hours per 24 hours. Okay. Something's really damaged by the sleep cycle. Again, it's an abnormal response to an everyday stimuli. The everyday stimuli is nightfall, and the normal response is sleeping. All God's creatures sleep at night, unless they're nocturnal, and it's the other way around. But you know what I mean. So I'm trying to get the child to be typical when it comes to sleeping. And I'll then ask if the 5-HTP, do we have inflammation going on here? Is that why the child's not sleeping? So I'll try a little bit of dye-free Motrin. I'll give them some Motrin, the right dose for the right age and weight, and the melatonin and the 5-HTP, and see if that works. So you kind of get a gist of what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to find out what is not working right with the child. Now remember, this is after we've done the gluten-free, dairy-free diet. And I'm trying to figure out what the source is of keeping the child awake. Many of the times, it's just a little bit of melatonin. Sometimes, if I give Motrin, like Advil, this is ibuprofen, never Tylenol. Don't ever give Tylenol to these children. What I'm trying to do is figure out in the brain what's going on. And Motrin is an anti-inflammatory. So I can find out pretty quickly if inflammation plays a role in that child's body. And by giving them an anti-inflammatory and they sleep great, well, I'm not going to keep giving them Motrin, but it tells me as a physician that I need to think about where I'm going to go with trying to figure out what's inflamed. Very often, these children can have something growing in the bowels that shouldn't be there, and that's causing inflammation. What can be there? Well, one of the things that I find is that they have a lot of overgrowth of yeast. It seems to be a little bit controversial in the pediatric medicine, but we do know, for example, that 80% of all sinus infections have a yeast component. So if your child has a yeast component in sinus infection and they only treated with an antibiotic, there can be a festering component of yeast within the nasal cavities. What about the gut? The gut can also have yeast. In fact, any part of the body, like the oral pharynx, the sinuses, everything from the mouth all the way down to the anus can have yeast. We can have yeast on the skin. I mean, who hasn't heard of a diaper rash that had a yeast component to it? We can have yeast infections on the skin elsewhere too. So I do have to use an antifungal because yeast is inflammatory. And that's one of the things that I like to make sure that we have going is a antifungal. Now, we can do some testing, and that's when you're going to need your physician involved with that, because the physician is going to have to order the testing and do the prescribing too, should we have a yeast infection. But you're not going to get very far if you have a yeast infection and it's not being treated. So I want to make sure that you know that there could be an infectious cause maybe yeast, maybe bacteria. What testing do I do? I like to do a stool test and a urine test, and I can't get it done at your local laboratory. That would be too easy, right? I use a laboratory for my stool testing called Doctor's Data, and I get a complete stool test. It gives me inflammatory markers. It tells me what's growing in the stool. It tells me the healthy bacteria. It tells me the potentially bad bacteria that's there. It's telling me if yeast is growing in there. It's telling me if we've got some kind of parasites. It also tells me about how the digestion is going, malabsorption. It gives me a lot of information about what's going on with that child's tummy. The urine organic acid test also tells me what's going on from a yeast and bacteria and even an anaerobic bacteria like Listeria. But the more elaborate testing I can do can tell me about Krebs cycle and vitamins. So I can get a lot of information just on 2 tests. It just makes sense. You know, looking at the stool is very, very important for kids who are not feeling well. In fact, pediatricians used to wear bow ties because moms would bring in the new baby and we'd always check the stool to see if it looked normal. But we didn't want to drag a regular tie into the diaper and get it contaminated, so we used to wear bow ties. But you won't find your doctor very interested when you come in and say, we've got horrific stools, they're orange stools or yellow stools. They're not very interested in that. But if you think about it, the stool and the urine is kind of our exhaust pipe. If you were to get behind a car and it's chugging out black or blue smoke, well, you don't have to be a mechanic to realize there's something wrong with that combustion engine. If you have a child who's chugging out, yellow, orange, runny, mushy, foul-smelling stools, once again, you can figure out there must be something wrong with that internal combustion engine, their tummy, the whole digestive tube. And I think it's really important to get a handle on that. Again, if the bowels aren't feeling good, the children are not going to sleep. We know, that if you don't feel good, you can manage through the day, but as soon as you lay down and go to sleep and your stomach hurts or whatever, it's not a good night of sleep. So these kids can go to sleep and then they wake up. But here's the catch. Once these kids have had about 4 hours sleep, their batteries are recharged. So if they get a cramp or a colic or a spasm, like at 1 or 2 in the morning and it wakes them up, they're awake. And that's it for the rest of the night. So it's very important. Again, that relates back to gluten and dairy because gluten and dairy can cause stomach pains too. And sometimes by removing the gluten and dairy, you remove the stomach pains, the constipation, the bad digestion we call maldigestion, and the children feel a whole lot better. So I think it's really important to take a look at, again, as you see the whole baby, not just we have autism. And you'll also see that when we talk about just autism, they make it sound like, oh, it's autism. And I'd be asking, well, what's causing this autism? It's kind of like if I had 4 kids out in the front office and each of them were coughing. One's coughing because they got asthma. One's coughing because they got a cold. One's coughing because they got allergies. And one's coughing because they had a toy part in their mouth and it went down and went into their lungs. The diagnosis is cough, but the underlying mechanism is totally different. You can't possibly treat them all the same. The same thing with autism. You can point out the kids who have autism. If you have one now, you could probably pick them out at Disney World or whatever. You don't need a $3,000 test in 4 days. There's one. But what's bringing them to be autistic, to have that autism spectrum? So, sometimes I get in trouble with older children with autism and they say, stop treating autism as if it's a disease. I have autism and I'm just fine with it. And I resent the way you're calling it a disease. And, I'll reply to them. I'll say, well, if you have autism and you fell down and broke your arm, would you not want me to fix that? Put it in a cast? Well, yeah. But you have autism. Yeah, but it has nothing to do with my broken arm. I agree. When I take care of children with autism, I'm not taking care of their autism per se, but I'm taking care of their food allergies, their chronic constipation, their diarrhea, their inflammatory bowel disease. I'm taking care of other things. And then they understand what I'm trying to do. It's as if they had a broken arm, I'm going to set that. If they have a broken tummy, I'm going to fix that. And I think we have to understand that for those type of people who are thinking that we're trying to label them as a disease, I'm not. But I would say that it's fine that you've got autism, but let's at least let you feel comfortable in the skin you're in, that you can eat without feeling pain, without feeling migraines, headaches, that you're doing self-injurious behaviors or you're trying to destroy things. Kind of my approach here. So the next thing that our new patients have to deal with is what? Supplements. Because if you're eating just a few things each day, where are you getting your vitamin C? My kid doesn't eat oranges. My kid doesn't drink orange juice. My kid doesn't do any citrus. We don't make vitamin C. We need to have a daily intake. In fact, the minimum daily requirement is 60 milligrams a day for us older people. Where are we going to get it from? So I had a endocrinologist who kind of knew what I was doing, kind of rolled his eyes, because he's mainstream, and kind of told him about what I'm telling you right now. And he kind of got it, but kind of poo-pooed it. Next time I came back in to see him, he was so excited he couldn't wait to tell me because he made his first diagnosis of scurvy because he had a child on the spectrum who for years was only eating the white foods, the crackers, potato chips, the crunchy, salty stuff. That's all this child ate. Very little protein and certainly no vitamins or minerals, and wasn't being supplemented. So by taking a dietary history, you can kind of figure out what things they're missing. They're missing omega oils. They put everybody on the omega oils. I mean, here at our office, we have our Mending Naturally omega oil, which is just amazing. Teaspoon twice a day. That dry hair, the skin, the dry skin and stuff, these kids need oil. The brain connections need oil. It's amazing that when you put these kids on omega oil, you can also get language. So they need omega oils. They need vitamins. I mean, goodness, if I have a child who's eating everything, I mean, they're eating fruits and vegetables and meats and stuff, avocados, I don't have to worry about vitamin supplementation. I can just target things like for language or target things for anxiety or obsessive compulsive. Obviously, those are discussions for another day. But I can target the basics. And they need the omega oils. They need a good multivitamin, a multivitamin powder or a capsule that they open up that is hypoallergenic, that's got great quality in that. And again, we have that line, but I mean, there are a lot of good lines out there to have as far as the multivitamin. They need vitamin D3. I haven't measured a child yet who unsupplemented had normal levels of vitamin D3. So the other things that I like to make sure that they have, besides the omega oil, the multivitamin, the vitamin D3, I like to put them on fiber. They don't get enough fiber. They're not eating enough vegetables, most of the kids that I see. Okay, so I'm going to put them on a soluble fiber. Our Mending Natural fiber is probably one of the best out there. I have other doctors telling me that they can't find anything like the Beta fiber or whatever because it gets chalky, it gets thick, man, you put this fiber into whatever they're drinking, it goes colorless, odorless, tasteless. And I don't have too many things that can do that, but I love to add the fiber. So those are the things that I add right off the top of the bat: a good multivitamin and mineral, a good oil, the vitamin D3, and I put them on the fiber. And I think that's where we're going to leave it for today. I did get one question though, and the question was a very good one, kind of advanced. It's not for the newbies. It's talking about if anybody's doing additional research on the effects of a medication called Suramin in children with autism. And the answer is no. There's just the one study. Suramin is a medication for sleeping sickness, but it seems to have some positive effects on autism because it's not really being produced a lot. It's like $3,000, something kooky, expensive for now. But if the studies show that it is helpful for socialization, helpful for recovery of some autistic traits that are getting in the way of good social skills, I'm sure it'll become available to the market. I mean, they would love to take an old medication, get a new patent for it, and sell it again and have a resurgence of demand for it. So it will come out. It's in a trial now, and it's going to take a while because obviously it's going to have to get FDA approved, and the cost is going to have to come down on it, or insurance will never pay it. The thing is that it can get approved by the FDA, and they're going to want $3,000 a month for this medication. The insurance companies are going to say, no, you can't have it. Oh, another question just came in, so let's see what we got here. What dose in general for vitamin D for kids do you recommend? Vitamin D is kind of a age and weight kind of dose. I tend to dose a little bit heavier. I think our children who are 1 year and older, I usually give them 1,000 IUs. It's an oil. I tend to go ahead and put it on the tip of the tongue. We can always have our family practice doctor, pediatrician here, check the blood levels of vitamin D, and we can kind of watch it. I'd like to get it up to the range of about 80 to 90 on a lab scale of 30 to 100. It's usually what I see in this country, and I like to have it around 80. When I measure them, they're usually under 15. And the lab will say, depending on the lab, 30 and above is sufficient. Under 30 is insufficient. Most of my kids are insufficient. For my 2, 3, 4-year-olds, I like 2,000 IUs. Okay. And then for my older kids, I might use more, might maintain them at 2,000 to 3,000 IUs per day. But I tend to follow their blood levels to make sure they're nice and juicy around 80. They protect you from ear infections and the flu, and it really gets your immune system bolstered. So we're out of time already. That was the fastest 30 minutes in broadcast history. I want to thank you very much for joining us, and I invite you to join me next Wednesday with your questions, and we're just going to keep moving on the topics. I'm not going to go back and repeat about gluten and dairy-free. We're just going to start attacking things like language, anxiety, obsessive compulsive behaviors. You name it, we got it. So thank you very much for tuning in, and I look forward to talking to you next week, Wednesday, 4 o'clock Eastern time. Be there. Count on it. Bye-bye now.